So, what exactly is psychology? If you do a quick Google search, you are going to come up with thousands of different definitions of psychology. There really isn't agreement about what psychology is. However, there are some overlap between all of the definitions in psychology, and one can just kind of put all these definitions together and come up with the idea that psychology is basically the study of human behavior and the mental processes that allow us to learn, function, and respond to various situations in our lives. So basically, psychology is the study of the mind. Of course, that begs the question, what is the mind? How does it differ from the brain? So think about all of these things as we go through this first week and we go through this course of what exactly is psychology and what does it encompass. So why should we even study psychology? Well, psychology provides us with new ways to look at and interpret the world around us. It helps us understand why people and why we behave the way we do. It helps us understand emotions and why people respond in certain ways. It gives us insight into ourselves and into other people. So it really puts things into perspective. Psychology is all around us. We cannot take ourselves out of psychology. Psychology is really basically who we are and how we are shaped and how we behave and respond and how we relate to other people. So it encompasses everything about us. And how do we think critically about psychology, and why should we even think critically? Well, here's what's really important. And I'm going to reiterate this several times throughout the course. I want you to think critically. I want you to question everything, be open to ideas, differing opinions, different perceptions, and look at multiple sides. And importantly, recognize that everything in psychology is created from a person's perspective, from their own subjective experiences. In other words, these theorists in psychology, they didn't create a theory based on objective observations, but these theories were based on their own experiences. Think about Freud. He created his theories, some of them a little bit weird, from his own personal experiences. And he had some pretty interesting experiences. So think about that, and we cannot and we should not believe everything that we hear. Question everything, and remember, everything's coming from a biased perspective in psychology. So question the theorists, question me. The things that I tell you are coming from my own personal perspective. And while I'm, pretty much right on everything, just kidding, you need to question your teachers. It's okay to open your minds and be critical. We need to question the world that we live in, the things that we watch on TV, the things that we hear. And remember, everything that we see and hear is coming from a biased perspective. So think critically. Is psychology even a science? I'm not going to answer that question for you because I want you to think critically. And there's really no right or wrong answer. It's just look at different sides, look at different opinions, and think critically about this question. So how do we even study psychology? Is it even possible? Can we study the variables in psychology through an objective lens? That's the million-dollar question. Think about that. Can we study, for instance, an emotion such as anger objectively? Because what one person sees as anger is different from another person's anger. It's not like in, say, chemistry, where we can measure something in a measuring cup. So we can't pour liquid anger into a measuring cup and measure it objectively. So that's the conundrum in psychology, is trying to measure certain variables through an objective lens. And how do we even measure things? What are the different research strategies? Well, it's important to differentiate between experimental designs and correlational. In correlational, we just can assume an association between two variables. We can't say that one caused the other. For instance, let's look at an adult who is addicted to heroin. That same adult had a childhood history of physical abuse. We cannot say that the abuse caused the addiction. All we can say is that there's a possible correlation, an association, that we do know that abuse increases the risk for later addictions, but we can't say that one caused the other, because there's so many different variables that could lead to addiction. There's so many risk factors involved, and it's hard. We aren't able to directly say what caused the addiction. So correlational is different than experimental research methods. In experimental research methods, we measure certain variables. We have an independent variable and a dependent variable. It's important to know the difference between dependent and independent. But we also have a confounding variable that can creep into that experimental design. A confounding variable or extraneous variable is it gives us less confidence in our results. So researchers always try to control for those confounding variables. Confounding variables could, for instance, include the time of day, or that might have an effect on somebody, or even the food somebody ate. So really we have to try to control for all of these extraneous variables so we can be certain in our independent and dependent variables. What is the Hawthorne effect exactly? Well, in research, the Hawthorne effect can be considered a confounding variable because it happens when our subjects or our participants might act in a way that they think the researcher wants them to act. So in other words, it doesn't really give us a true measure of the variables that we're trying to assess, because the participant isn't really, is not really being real in whatever it is that we're measuring, but rather they are kind of trying to please the researcher. So we have to really be careful, and that's one of the dangers of experimental research. In other research designs, such as naturalistic observations, we're just observing from a distance. We might observe students walking across campus to see how many are on their cell phone. Well, they don't know that we're observing them, so they're not going to act in a certain way because they're being observed, because they don't know they're being observed. So also, what is the placebo? Well, most of you know what a placebo effect is. The placebo effect is when a participant thinks that they are in the experimental group, which means the group that's getting the real treatment, and they'll act in a way that is they're getting better. Or for instance, if we're trying to study whether a certain therapy helps people, and we have a control group and the experimental group, the control group is the one that really gets the placebo, and then the experimental group is the one that doesn't. So oftentimes, we have these two groups so that we can determine whether our therapy or our medication is effective. The placebo effect just happens when a participant thinks that he or she is getting the actual medication or the actual treatment, and they'll act accordingly. So those are just some things to know about studying psychology. And it is difficult to study psychology because, as I said before, there's so many different things that can contribute to behaviors. So it's hard, almost impossible, it is impossible to determine what exactly caused a behavior, what exactly caused an emotion. So, and think about how we measure these different variables. How would we measure anger? Well, one of the ways is through operationalizing. We create an operational definition of anger so that we can measure it. And this might include using some sort of measurement tool. Could be, for instance, if we're studying anxiety, we might use the Beck Anxiety Inventory and use that score that from that Beck Anxiety Inventory as our measure of anxiety. Of course, we have to remember that even the Beck Anxiety Inventory is a self-report measure. So it's only as good as what the person reports, and that person reports his or her subjective experiences. So again, there's a lot of different caveats and issues that go into studying different variables in psychology. What are the levels of analysis in psychology? What exactly does that even mean? So basically, what that really means is we look at behaviors through 3 different perspectives: biological, psychological, and sociocultural. For instance, if a client comes to me and is demonstrating these different symptoms that could be possibly indicative of a mental disorder, I'm going to look at those symptoms through 3 different levels: the biological, psychological, and sociocultural. For instance, I'm going to say, what sort of genetic causes might be influencing this behavior? And if I look at from a psychological perspective, I'm going to look at, how did this person perhaps learn to have anxiety? How was his or her anxiety learned from his or her environment? Or how was it learned from a socio-cultural perspective? So this could include their culture, their religion, their beliefs, the way that they were raised. So we want to look at a person through all these different angles and through all these lenses, because it really helps us understand the behaviors. So again, for instance, somebody comes into our office and is demonstrating some symptoms that look like ADHD, for instance. I'm going to look at all different perspectives. I'm going to look at, from the biological perspective, what happened when that child was in the womb? Is there any kind of genetic predisposition? I'm going to take a family history. I'm also going to look at the environment. Could there be another explanation for these behaviors? For instance, was there a recent trauma, a stressor? Did that child's parents go through a divorce recently? What about any abuse? Was there anything in that environment that might have triggered these symptoms? Then I'm also going to look at the culture, because different behaviors are seen differently in different cultures. We're also going to look at the different values and beliefs of that environment. So again, we're going to take all those little perspectives and look at behaviors through that lens, through the lens of biological, sociocultural, psychological, to understand how that behavior or those symptoms might have developed. And what are the different subfields and careers in psychology? Oh goodness, the options are endless. And they include everything from developmental psychologists, clinical psychologists, counseling psychologists, forensic psychologists, experimental psychologists, sports psychologists, industrial organizational psychologists, social workers, counselors, marriage and family therapists, neuropsychologists, art therapists, substance abuse counselors, addiction psychologists, and even psychiatrists. The list goes on. It's important to recognize what is the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist. So the psychiatrist is an MD. He or she has gone through medical school. So he or she can prescribe medications. And mostly today, the psychiatrists don't really do any counseling, and they're not trained a whole lot in counseling. They diagnose and prescribe. The psychologist, on the other hand, has a PhD, has his or her doctorate in psychology. And he or she does counseling, also just different types of psychological testing. And in a few states, I think there's only 3, he or she can obtain a special license to be able to prescribe medication. That's only in a few states. I know Louisiana is one of them. So to become a licensed psychologist, having a degree in having a doctorate in psychology is not enough. You have to obtain an internship, which is about 2 years in length, and then take the exam and pass the exam. Now, that's something that's important to remember, is a degree in psychology does not make a person a psychologist. In fact, they can't even call themselves a psychologist with a degree in a doctorate in psychology, but no license in psychology. So, okay, so then you also have licensed counselors. Licensed counselors can be licensed at the master's level or the doctorate level. And they obtain at least 60 hours at the master's level, plus a 2-year, a 3,000 hour, can't be any less than 2 years, a 3,000 hour supervised internship, plus, and that's after graduate school, plus they also have to take the licensure exam. So those, so it's important to recognize that in the field of psychology, we have psychiatrists, psychologists, and counselors. And then we also just have a sprinkling of other people. So it's a wide open field where, any of your interests can really be directed through psychology. And there's different theoretical perspectives in psychology. Our textbook provides the list right here of the ones that Myers sees as the current perspectives. Every textbook's going to have a list that's similar but might differ. These are really just the different perspectives that it's different than the levels of analysis. Because remember, the levels of analysis, every perspective will utilize those. But basically, in the current perspectives, and each of these perspectives, the focus is a little bit different. So for instance, when we look at the behavioral perspective, we're looking at how people learn responses. Like, how are their behaviors learned? We're basically focused on behaviors and shaping of behaviors. And then in psychology and cognitive, in the cognitive perspective, we're interested in the thought processes. How do thoughts influence even behaviors and responses? So it's really just, it's important to understand that there are these different perspectives in psychology, and each of them has a different focus. And but really, psychology, when we look at people, it's hard to just take one of these focuses into account, because people are made up of so many different ingredients, and it's genetics, it's their thinking, it's their behaviors, it's their culture, it's, so many different ingredients make up who a person is and becomes.